Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Literacy View. We are doing a series of podcasts on adolescent literacy. And the first people that came to my mind, people I've known a while on social media, are James and Dianne Murphy. And they are adolescent literacy specialists in this space. And let me introduce you to them. So, Dianne Murphy is a specialist reading intervention designer and teacher trainer working in secondary schools. She is the author of Thinking Reading, and I have that book right here, fabulous book. And James and Dianne wrote this book together. She also has a program called Thinking Reading, and that is a high impact program specifically designed to meet the needs of adolescent struggling readers. James Murphy is her co-author of Thinking Reading, What Every Teacher Needs to Know About Reading. And James has worked in secondary schools in New Zealand and the UK as an English teacher, head of English, and senior leader. He is director of school partnerships at Thinking Reading, focused on assisting schools with implementation of effective literacy strategies. And we welcome James and Dianne with us here today. And our topic today is, does the science of reading include middle and high school, that secondary education space that we rarely talk about, but it's so important because we know there are kids slipping through the cracks all the time. And the article that we will use is Tim Shanahan's article, Does the Science of Reading Include Middle School? But we're stretching it out to middle and high school. And I'm going to open up with the teacher question of this article. And a teacher asked Tim Shanahan, what does the science prioritize for middle level ELA instruction? Is there a point when teaching into a phonics gap for students does not have a payoff? With limited time in a middle school classroom, I am thinking about what needs to be prioritized. And I think there are a lot of teachers out there who have those same questions. Do I teach phonics in middle school? How much phonics do I teach? Is there a point where I don't need to teach phonics? So we have the experts here today. So I don't care who begins. You two decide. Unmute yourself when you're ready. And let's hear it from James and Dianne.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I think the key question that we've kind of been, that you've been talking about, and we've just been discussing amongst ourselves was, if you're going to teach phonics at middle school, you're talking about children who are, 12, 13 years old. How can you be teaching phonics to that group and still cover your mainstream curriculum? So phonics is definitely relevant to a subgroup of students, but it's unlikely that you can do a lot with phonics in a general classroom. We would favor tier 2 or tier 3 instruction for addressing phonics problems for adolescents, primarily because of the curriculum time cost for them. If you are trying to teach all of those things and your curriculum, everybody's going to lose.
And also, I would just add to that, by the time children have reached the age of about 12 or 13 and they're way behind in their reading, they all have a different learning history. So they've all got different needs. And if we have the expectation that children are going to catch up completely, and I think it's really important that they do, that, the onus is on us. We need all children to leave school being able to read well. then we need to make sure that we tailor the program to meet their individual needs. One thing that's I think is not really taken into account a lot of the time when we intervene with children, we tend to think so much about the timetable and the needs of the school, but we don't often think about the needs of the child in as much as, are we wasting the child's time? And I've seen children, sitting in group intervention, and they're being taught things that they already know. That's a waste of their time. So it's so important that we make sure that we screen, that we assess them, and we tailor a program to meet their individual needs.
That's such an excellent point. Judy and I, my co-host Judy Boxner, is a coach in New York City, working in an elementary school, primarily in the younger grades. And we always talk about the importance of assessment. So, Judy, your thoughts about what James and Dianne just said, in particular about that assessment piece when you're working with older students. So we both tutor, and in our tutoring practices, we see that there are kids who might not need what, the schools are offering. They go into an intervention class and we assume, well, that's what they need. And that's not exactly what they need. So Judy, can you comment?
So thank you, James and Dianne, for being here today. I've heard only the best things from Faith about you guys, and I'm just so delighted to meet you guys virtually, but kind of in person. So thank you for being here today. So, in my experience, I've been in education now probably 28 years. I've definitely seen older kids, even though I work with, the younger band at work. I've seen a lot of older kids that struggle, especially even in my private tutoring. And, it's a very, very sore spot, because it's painful to see older kids that have not broke the code. And it just brings so many questions to mind, like what happened? Was it poor instruction? Was it lack of attention? Was it just, did they just come to this country? So many questions come into play. So my first question to you guys, at the site that I'm at, we have shifted away from balanced literacy years ago now. We're using a screener known as Acadians. I think it's a game changer. I love it. I think it gives a lot of information very quickly. And but I also see it as an underutilized tool in a lot of schools, because people don't realize that you can use it for higher grades as well. I don't think it goes up to 12th grade. I think it goes up to 8th grade though. But a lot of schools are using it K-2, but then they're using things that I don't think are as effective for older grades, like iReady and different things. So my first question, and it actually comes from an administrator in Brooklyn, New York, District 21. Her name is Lisa Terrero. She actually is an administrator in a high school. And this is the question that she had regarding assessment. She said, what assessments do you recommend to identify students in the middle and high school levels that need intervention? Because, they know that data is where it's at. And a lot of schools were running summer school programs, and there were kids that couldn't speak English. And, a lot of schools had trouble determining what's the best starting point, especially when there's so many kids with different needs in the classroom. And then on top of it, a lot of kids that have special needs and ENL as well. So I'm looking to the experts.
Okay, maybe if I just talk about the screening program that we use, and you can talk specifically about what we use. So we advocate for 3 tiers of screening. So rather than just have individual teachers refer children who they're aware that they're failing in reading, we advocate for being proactive and actually screening the whole school. So we use a whole school assessment, but then we take the children who score in the bottom third and run a different form of that assessment, because one thing that we want to do is to screen out the children who have performed poorly solely because of poor motivation. And, you know, being in an intervention is an expensive business, and we don't want to use that money unwisely. So it's important that the right children are in the program. But then after that, the children who score in, who are reading, the children who score in the bottom third of that second assessment, we then test them individually, and that's reading graded prose, because through doing that, we can actually see whether they're making the same mistake. Well, if they can read something correctly at one point, and another point they're reading it incorrectly, which shows us that it's undoubtedly due to motivation. You know, that it's not a chronic error. But you might want to talk about the specific assessments that we advocate schools use.
So we generally advocate for schools to use as a first and a second screen a standardized reading test. Now, the problem at secondary schools, unlike lower primary or elementary, is that most tests that are normed up to 16 years are primarily reading comprehension tests. So they have very little decoding element in them. We know of one that is a digitally based one that is adaptive. And as you, if the student starts scoring low, it will then move them on to more decoding type questions. Now, again, the problem with that is how reliable is that? Was that because the student was just tapping through the answers on the computer, or were they actually really genuinely struggling? The standardized test algorithm doesn't know that. All it knows is the kid gave this answer, so now I'm going to give them that question. So therefore, the standardized tests are very good for ranking the students against the general population, and that tells us they might have a problem. The second round, especially if it's accompanied by something of a pep talk, say, okay, guys, you're here because we think you may be able to do a lot better than your original score. In fact, we're sure some of you can. We don't want to have to keep bringing you back here to test you. So please give us your absolute best reading. And we certainly don't want you taking up space in an intervention if you don't need it. Most children, when they understand that rationale, will do their best in the reading test, if only to avoid continually being tested. And then the program that, or the test that we are using as a one-to-one screen it's actually from New Zealand publishers called Triune, and it's called Probe. I don't believe it has American norms, but I know that it is used in Australia and the UK, and some teachers in the US I've spoken to are familiar with it. But that has 20 levels of graded prose, and they are adjusted for reading difficulty up to the age of 15 and a half, as in terms of a reading level. Now, those aren't standard age scores, they are approximations, and we never pretend that they are anything but an approximation. But it gives you a starting point, and it means that you know straight away what the gap is between the child's current age and the level at which they're reading. And that's the most significant thing. That's the first thing that we need to get out of the assessment process. How far behind is that individual student? And we're particularly interested in separating out their decoding and their comprehension scores, because many of those students who got a low score on the standardized test are actually good decoders. And I've seen children sitting in a phonics program for 4 hours a week, and they didn't need phonics. And so when you think about the cost to them of their curriculum time, the school's decision has effectively meant that those students are guaranteed to fail at a later point when they sit their end of school exams. The school's decision has done that because of inadequate assessment. So that's why we say assessment is absolutely crucial.
Yeah, Judy's holding up that cheers button, and I agree with her. Cheers to both of you. That was a really comprehensive response. Thank you. Cheers. Big cheers. So we are going to focus on Tim Shanahan a bit. Now, you know, in this country, Tim is a very well-respected researcher, and pretty much everybody in literacy will always point to Tim Shanahan if they want, you know, a definitive answer on something. You know, they look to him. And what I found interesting in this article was that Tim shifted his position from what he thought from years ago to what he thinks now. And I love that he modeled that a researcher is modeling. Oh, I think I'm getting cheers from Judy. I saw her hearts go up. All right. Thank you, Judy. So, yeah, so I think we're both excited about that.
By accident, I held up the wrong one. So Tim Shanahan, I apologize. It's the cheers button. Sorry.
So we, you know, I think we need to see researchers own that. And you don't always see that. And there are some people in that research space who still will stick to a story because, I don't know, maybe they feel their reputation is at stake, or I don't know, for whatever reason, they don't come right out and change their position. But in this article, Tim said, well, if you would have asked me this years ago, I would have had this answer. But now I do think that phonics is important for older students if it's a severe enough problem. And he separated that out, talking about how, well, if it's a minor decoding problem, probably spelling and morphology, you know, meaningful word parts for those people in our audience, you know, working with syllables and not syllables, rather, prefixes and suffixes and roots and that kind of thing would be helpful, along with spelling, more than phonics. What's your position on this? Do you agree with Tim's assessment? What did you think of his shift in terms of what he thinks now from what, you know, he would have said then? Just curious about that.
Yeah. Yes, and we would agree with that. And but you know, it's interesting looking at the research articles that, you know, he mentions, and how you know, that's, no, sorry, you're going to edit this, aren't you? Oh, you can't.
This
Muted.
is unedited, and we just go with it. We'll see, maybe, but basically we let it go. We let it go, but it's all right. Everybody takes a chance to think about something and move on. So we just want to hear what you have to say.
Just have fun.
So you're muted now.
Right. So, yeah, I think we'd agree with him, but we'd go a little bit further in that he says below a particular level of decoding proficiency, some students can't improve. And we would say, no, that's not right. The issue is not the students. The issue is how powerful is the instruction. And so the point is, if the child is 2 years behind, probably Tier 1 instruction is not going to be sufficient. If they're 3 years behind, they are going to need Tier 1 instruction. If they're 12, 13 years old, and we've taught students who are older than that, and Diane's taught a student who was, how far behind was he?
He was reading at a 6-year level, and he was aged 14.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so he gained 9 years in 13 months. So can they learn? Yes. Can they learn in a general classroom setting? Not on its own.
No. Yeah. And I think also, you know, coming back to the idea of targeted instruction and just looking at what are the gaps of individual students and teaching to those gaps. But the other thing that I would actually say with older struggling readers, it's much, much easier to teach children to read properly from the beginning. When you've got an older struggling reader, they have gaps in their learning, but they invariably have learnt really, you know, faulty strategies. And trying to keep their motivation up and correct those strategies is actually quite complex. And you need to be a bit of a behaviour coach to be able to do that.
That's true.
So, I mean, reading through these comments, and yes, you know, certainly, you know, agree with Tim, but, you know, I see the intervention happening in classes. And I think by the time children are older, it needs to be individualized. Yeah. So, it's no wonder that there wasn't success if it's happening within the general classroom. You got anything to add?
Faith, can I say something also for a second? James, you just said probably something that spoke to me more than anything in a really long time, that in 9 months of quality instruction, you will make that, I think it was Dianne was able to make up 13 years of learning loss. That was incredible. And I think that is so powerful for people to realize that we cannot give up on these older kids. But I think that it brings up a really important point, and it's another question that I had from an administrator. How do administrators make a decision of what is most is going to help a kid crack the code as quickly as possible? I know a lot of schools are using programs like Spire, UFLI. I know Faith uses something called Word Wasp and Hornet. How do, you know, these administrators and teachers make a decision so that the process does move quickly like it did for Dianne with that student? Because those kids might not be in high school for a very long time. They might only have a year left or 2 years left. How do we expedite the process for efficiency?
I wrote it. Yeah. The program that I used is a program that I wrote myself. So it's a program that I started to develop in New Zealand. James and I were both lucky over 25 years ago. First of all, it was James did a diploma in special teaching needs. And he said to me, you should do this. You should do this. And I came to teaching much later, and I was teaching primary school, elementary school children. I was teaching 6-year-olds. And I had 2 boys who were struggling with reading. I can't say they were failing, but they certainly weren't making the progress that I expected and wanted to see. And I spoke to a colleague who said to me, Dianne, you just have to accept you will always have children who will fail. And as soon as she said that to me, and I don't think that it's not a common thought, but it's certainly out there. It's not uncommon. And, you know, after all, it's the bell curve, isn't it? And, you know, when she said that to me, and I just thought, we're responsible for those children in our classroom. And I knew at that moment I needed to go and do this diploma in special teaching needs. And now, for both of us, we would say professionally, that was the best year after all these years. And one of the things we learned about was Zig Engelman's direct instruction, and Carl Binder's precision teaching, all about fluency, and applied behavior analysis. And I ended up in a situation where I was an itinerant teacher, and I couldn't teach the children myself. I had to have a program that either a teaching assistant or a teacher could implement. And I found that there were these children in late primary, early secondary who were failing at reading. So I basically started writing a program that could be delivered under supervision. and kind of I kept about one, 2 steps ahead of the teaching assistants. And that program was developed over many years. But the children can easily make, on average, over the course of the program, 3 months progress for every half-hour lesson. So this boy who I taught, he actually made 9 years progress in 13 months. But that's just one. That happened a lot. But what is so heartwarming is to see the change in those young people. If you're at secondary school, age 13, 14, and you still haven't learned to read, just the lack of self-efficacy. And, what would happen is the other teachers would comment on the change in them, the change in their demeanor. And, obviously they're, able to learn so much better. So they don't just learn to read, they learn that they can learn.
Yeah.
So that one boy, he went into the 6th form, he became a student leader. Well, first of all, he got 5 A stars to C at the end of year 11, which is a pass.
Good pass.
A really good pass. Went on to become a student leader in the 6th form. That boy went to university. Now, the prognosis for him when I first picked him up was not great. He had failure written across his forehead. There were no expectations of him. So, learning to read, they can defy those expectations.
Yes. And, I think what you said before, Dianne, about behavior, I don't think we talk about that enough. We focus on the instruction, but as kids get older, and obviously younger children can also act up, but as they've had repeated years of failure, of low self-esteem, as you were saying, the behaviors can intensify, or they become withdrawn. Sometimes they want to just shrink and disappear, or they act out. So what you mentioned before was individualized instruction for these severe cases. How do we impress upon middle school and high school leadership that these kids need one-on-one, because all this is expensive, and they tend to throw kids in and lump them together with other kids, but we know that older kids want to shield themselves from the embarrassment in front of being, in front of other kids. So what's the message? How do you get that important message across to leadership?
So I think one of the first issues for people to think about is this issue of expense. Because like it or not, if the belief persists that you can't do much for these kids, they're really hard to teach, and they're kind of obviously lacking in potential or ability anyway, if those are the beliefs in the system, then it would make no sense to invest funds and resources in them. So they tend, as you say, to be lumped together into groups because that's cheaper for staffing. They'll also be given often less experienced or less skilled staff, and there will be no or very few expectations of progress made. So the net result is you're not going to get much progress. So the message to administrators and leaders would be, is this actually a priority? Do you know how much this is costing your country because of lost productivity? Okay. In the US, it is in trillions of dollars. In the UK, it is in billions of pounds. We're talking upwards of 50, 60 billions of pounds, roughly the equivalent of running the whole system of education in England and Wales, is lost in the economy because we didn't teach 10% of the students properly. So that's a policy level decision, but don't wait until they change the policy. If you're a leader and you've got the ability, use your resources strategically. The second thing is that those children are going to experience massive costs in their lives if you, as a school leader, do not make the right decisions about how to get those needs met and resolved. So what Dianne was saying earlier was, if I remember rightly, the standard should be they will catch up before they leave school. And then the question is, can we do what it takes? And the answer to that is you can't just throw money at a program. You have to invest long-term in expertise. We talked about this on Twitter, I think, a while back, Faith. It's fine to give them a program, but the program is a tool. What you need is someone who's really good at using that tool.
Okay, James, you have to get a cheers again. I'm sorry. Sorry. Like,
I'm glad it wasn't the other one.
everybody repeat after me. The program is a tool. Judy, chime in with me. Let's do
All
it.
right, let's all say it, all four of us. 1, 2, 3, go.
The program is a tool. Okay.
Choral reading.
Don't be a tool. The program is a tool.
Yep.
Don't be a tool. So I can't stress that enough, that we have to invest in expertise. I mean, come on. It's driving us crazy when we see people constantly splitting hairs over one program and another core program, when there are very few differences in core programs, at least in this country, that people are sweating over. If you don't have the people who could use those programs well, it's not going to make a difference. I want to take a line out of your book, both of you. It's on page 95 of Thinking Reading, and it's under the section of develop a corpus of effective teaching strategies which are used across all subject areas. Okay. This is really important here because I don't think we have schools, at least in this country, who feel that in middle school and high school that subject area teachers are reading teachers too, but they should be. So what is that core group? If you want to talk about a core group that goes across a whole school, what would they be? You're both smiling at each other, so we want to hear what you're smiling about.
Program.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we've just been working on a little booklet for a conference that's coming up that sets out some core strategies. So it's kind of fresh in our minds. So now I hope I can remember them. But the first one we would say is you have to know your students. And the best way that teachers can get to know what their students' reading is like is over a period of time, over the first 2 or 3 weeks in the school, make a space for every student to read to you. Not because you're an expert in reading, you just want to hear them read. You just want to know which students have that issue, okay? And that's just a case of the rest of the class is working, just come up and say, hi, Brian, how's it going? Yeah, so tell me about this paragraph. Okay, do you want to read the next one to me? That's all it takes. And you just say, well done, that's great. You might pick up 1 or 2 errors, but probably not first time around. And you just reassure that student, you like knowing how they read, and you're not fazed or embarrassed or worried about it. They are safe with you. And then the second set of things after that is to have a set of ground rules that are explicit to your whole class about when we read in our classroom, these are the ground rules. Like what happens in here stays in here. We never take stuff outside. If someone makes a mistake, we don't embarrass them about it later. We never laugh at people. We never tut. We don't tell them the word. Rather, we help them to work out what the word might be, and we always wait and give them thinking time. Having those ground rules explicit, again, makes the classroom safer for the struggling reader, and it helps other students to be really clear about how they can support each other. And it means that you've got a sound basis then for actually saying to someone, I'm sorry, do you remember our ground rules? We said we weren't going to laugh at anybody. What do you need to do here? And they apologize or whatever, but you keep that classroom safe and you enforce those ground rules. That's the second thing. And then the third thing is, one of the most powerful things any teacher can do for their students is to build their vocabulary, because that's what they need to access the curriculum. So a lot of the models for teaching vocabulary are very time consuming, and that means that they come at significant cost to curriculum coverage. So you have to have a vocabulary teaching strategy that can be done for less than about a minute per word, that maximizes student responses, and that covers the sound and spelling, the etymology and morphology of the word, and gives examples and non-examples of usage. I haven't got time now, I don't think, to demonstrate that. But that vocabulary, we say to teachers, the only way you can do that is by using choral responding, getting the whole class to respond in unison, picking up the kids who got it wrong or who hesitated or who tried to drop out. Because that means every child, you've now ramped up the response rate by about 20 or 30 times by getting everybody to do it instead of one or two. The fourth thing is having strategies for teaching comprehension. I'm just going to mention a couple of quick ones. Concept check questions, where you give the child two alternatives, one of which is clearly right, one of which is clearly wrong. So when the soldier went to war, was he happy or sad? He was happy. And when he was in the trenches, was he happy or sad? He was sad. Okay, and then the kid goes, oh, I get it. So it's a really fast way. Use closed questions to guide students through the key ideas that they need to navigate the text. The fifth one would be to ensure that when you read as a class, you use a variety of different formats. Teacher reading aloud, reading in pairs, reading in small groups. And again, all of these need ground rules taught. We tend not to recommend just one person reading at a time around the room and everybody else following. It's a recipe for boredom for able readers. It's frustrating, and it makes even able readers anxious about their turn. Silent reading is fine for brief periods as long as there's talking and thinking time afterwards. And the last one I would say is you have to be really systematic with yourself about maintaining positive expectations and making really clear acknowledgements of student progress all the time to maintain motivation and to keep expectations high.
So in listening to your suggestions, one thing that triggered a thought was writing. Judy and I have been talking a lot on this show about the connection of writing and comprehension. Judy, do you have any questions about that combination for James and Dianne between reading comprehension and written response, writing for understanding? Any thoughts about that?
Question. So I see it even in early childhood. So very often a lot of kids can comprehend way more than they can produce, in written format. And that seems to be a really big struggle for even teachers at the early level. A lot of administrators are expecting artifacts from kids that show, not that they're able to just articulate, main idea, theme, different things like that. So what are some suggestions that you might have? Because the writing piece very often for a lot of learners, in my experience, takes more time, and there's so many things that go into writing. And what could we do to help kids so that they're able to articulate that they understand, but also be successful if they have to put it down on paper?
I'll start on that. So what we would say,
English classroom English teacher.
what we would say, based on our backgrounds, is almost invariably the presenting problem is not the problem to solve. The child is slow, halting, has disjointed sentences, and incomplete thoughts. That, as you say, that is not necessarily a reflection of what's going on in their head or what they understand. The issue is that they are not fluent enough in their component skills to be able to go through the writing process at a speed that matches their speed of thought. And so consequently, those component skills, everything will be slowed down to the rate of the slowest. So if they're slow at handwriting, if that's their slowest skill, that's as fast as it'll go. And of course, once you slow things down, that impedes your comprehension, that impedes your thought process, because our brains aren't wired to think at the speed of 1 word per second. You want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I guess one thing that we've both noticed over the last wee while, we just did a trip and visited a school in the States and in New York and New Zealand and Australia. And it was how poor handwriting skills are. And obviously, it's the use of keyboards and so on, but that's something that's really fallen by the way, and it's something that's so it's so important to build up those handwriting skills. They've been neglected.
We've talked about this numerous times. One of our recent guests is a director of the Iowa Reading Research Center, Sean Datchuk, and he had a whole thing on handwriting, and we talked about that, but we've been talking about that a lot. So Judy, in those early grades, what I'm hearing Dianne and James talk about and what we've said numerous times, those foundational skills, the most basic types of things have to be automatic. And so as a coach this year, I'm sure you're thinking about that quite a bit, Judy.
I definitely am. And, we're introducing foundations actually on my site for 3rd grade. And Faith and I were going back and forth about cursive and writing. And do we just cut the part? And, we're not going to cut it, because obviously there's a connection between, handwriting and the brain and comprehension and all these pieces. It will only enhance and help students. And I don't think it's an area that we should neglect. But so my question still remains though a little bit. So what do we do with these kids that, maybe they have gaps in their knowledge building, but they're not in their knowledge building, in their foundational skills, but then they have to sit through about maybe 45 minutes of reading instruction, ELA, we call it in the States, and 45 minutes of writing, ELA, and they have deficits. How do we make sure that that time is not a painful time for them and that they're still, gaining something? Because what I'm seeing very often is the teachers are doing the heavy lifting. The teachers are doing all the work. Sometimes, everybody talks about the gradual release model, and I'll see some of the I do, some of the we do, and then, okay, let's move on. And the you do didn't happen because there's this assumption that kids can't do it. So how do we make sure that when it's not the foundational skills block and it's ELA, reading and writing time, that we're making sure that students that might still have gaps are still, successful or producing?
Yeah, so I think that the key thing here, we've talked a little bit about that word fluency and fluency in those component skills. The really good news about building fluency is that you can actually get more result by working really hard for a minute or 3 minutes than you can with mass practice for half an hour. I got very little result from as a young teacher from giving my kids half an hour to write something, and I didn't realize what lovely children I was teaching because they would just write for half an hour. I did not deserve that level of compliance. But what I found later was, I'd always have like the reluctant boys who would take ages to get started and everything else. And instead you said, right, I put a word on the board. I'm going to give you 3 minutes to write as many properly spelled, syntactically accurate words as possible on that topic. The time starts 3, 2, 1 now. They write flat out, and they would write more in 3 minutes or 5 minutes than they would in half an hour. So what the precision teaching researchers found was, here's what you've got to do with practice. It should be short. Okay. You actually, paradoxically, we get more endurance and stamina from sprints than we do from marathons in training. I'm not talking about running, I'm talking about academic skills. So practice should be short. It should be daily. It should be timed. The unit of timing should be rate per minute, but the length of timing should be appropriate to the activity. Some activities obviously can't be completed in a minute. Some might be 3 minutes or 5 minutes or 10 minutes. But giving students a time limit helps them to focus very much on how much they do in that time. Another aspect of it is having sufficient practice materials so that we don't create an artificial ceiling for students where they've used them all up and they can't get any faster. So having a lot of materials to work with if they need them. And it should be, lastly, carefully sequenced. So it should be gradually more and more complex. And what I've found, and certainly what I've seen in the research around precision teaching, is that you can build students' fluency of reading and writing and their accuracy and fluency of spelling in about 3 to 5 minutes a day. And that includes the time they spend with a partner checking each other's work. And that's what I would recommend teachers look at as a way of building those foundational skills to fluency without actually compromising their overall curriculum and the direction of travel they have for the whole class.
In this country, direct instruction is underutilized. So Zig Engelman's direct instruction, precision teaching model, that people find is boring. They'll say, drill and kill and whatever that expression is. Just the whole idea of doing that, teachers will find boring. However, there's a ton of research on it that it's effective. And so it's good for the kids, but educators don't really want to use it, or they're resistant to using it. You will very rarely see that direct instruction, Zig Engelman's type of work being utilized in this country. I see Judy wanting to jump in to say
Yeah, Faith, I want you to give an example so that the teachers in the States or wherever they're listening would understand like a real example of something like that.
Okay, so we're not talking about direct instruction as a general term, like give them explicit instruction. We're not talking about just explicit instruction. There is a model called DI, direct instruction. If you look up Engelman, he has a body of work on DI, direct instruction. And it's this idea of this quick choral response from all children. I mean, I can't explain it all now on a podcast, but I will tell people that I'm talking about capital D, capital I, direct instruction, precision teaching, Zig Engelman. And it has not really taken off. It's been around for years and years and years and years. And there was so much resistance to it. It kind of cycles back sometimes with some people. Actually, there is a podcaster who I have a lot of respect for on Twitter, Zach.
Groeschel.
Say it again.
Zach Groeschel.
That's it, Groeschel. Zach Groschel. He talks a lot about it. He did a couple of segments on his podcast on it. He's a big proponent of it. So people could take a look at his work as well in his podcast. Yes.
That's interesting. What I took from James, and I'm hoping I'm understanding correctly, is so when I was a classroom teacher, I broke things down into little chunks. And what I'm seeing is like kids are being asked to produce so much. So is what you're kind of saying that if I want to just teach how to write a topic set and maybe an introduction, and then the next day, continue or go back and so forth, that sometimes it's better to break things into short chunks rather than produce more and more and more and more. Because I know that sometimes I found more success on breaking things into little chunks for students. I've had success like that. So I'm just wondering, is that what you were kind of also referencing?
Yeah, that's particularly important for students who are further behind. So again, one of Engelman's principles is, to just kind of put it in context, the thing about Engelman's direct instruction is that it is a fully developed, systematic set of teaching principles which can be applied in practice and which can be evaluated in practice. And there isn't anything else with anything like that level of sophistication out there. And, that even applying some of the things he says will lead to improvements. But if you add them all together, they lead to very powerful improvements. But one of the things Engelman says is, when you teach something, you should be able to teach it clearly enough and have a teaching sequence that gives students the ability to respond immediately and get feedback immediately, so that mastery could probably be induced in a few minutes. And so that idea of small chunks is really important, but they also have to be carefully sequenced. The other thing about the drill thing is, of course, that if you actually look at what happens to children who build their basic skills to very high levels of fluency, and the excitement they get from the sense of achievement, and the ease which they then combine those skills and begin to do things they couldn't do, it's not drill and kill at all, it's drill and thrill. Okay, so if someone says drill and kill to you, the answer is no, we drill and thrill.
Excellent.
And
Dianne?
something that I would say to teachers who don't like DI, one, it's not about you, it's about the children. What can we do so that we can teach things much more effectively so that children are going to learn and they're going to retain? We don't, actors don't go, I have to learn these lines. They make it their own. Learn the lines, yes, absorb it, but you can make it your own in your presentation. Nobody is ever advocating teaching using DI all day, every day. And the other thing, as teachers, we can often be quite verbose. And when you have verbosity, the children don't necessarily learn that little nugget that you are trying to teach. And I think people don't really appreciate with direct instruction the faultless communication and all the work that's gone into preparing that script so that it ensures that there is no option but that the child learns what is being presented.
Yep.
I love that. And I've said that, those exact words, it's not about you. I've said that numerous times. It's not about you. This is about the children learning, not about your personal preferences. And I'm glad you mentioned that, and the idea about really that careful communication so there's no misunderstanding with the child. Here's my last question for me, and I want to talk about fluency. We keep talking about automaticity and fluency. I've read Jack Fletcher's book on learning disabilities. I don't know if you have, but one thing he brings out in his book, Learning Disabilities, is he said that fluency is best developed K to 2. And that for older children, although you could teach them to decode words and understand, there's always going to be this gap with fluency in terms of getting them up to a speed that you would hope is understandable and productive. I guess a productive speed. We're not talking about speed reading. What are your thoughts about that? My personal feeling is if you go back to the basics well enough, you can get kids up to a nice rate of fluency. I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
So we use precision teaching in the thinking reading program. And, if you look at the stages of learning, acquisition, accuracy, fluency, it's really important that those steps are covered in sequence. But, once the children are accurate, you can build their fluency by using timed practice. And we see that, time and time again. And it's actually an activity that the children enjoy because they're not competing against anybody else. They're competing against themselves, wanting to improve their score. And, just seeing the sense of achievement when they do that is fantastic, and it leads to them, retaining all of that learning.
So I just wanted to say to the audience, what I'm hearing Dianne say and what I know about precision teaching is kids each have their own graph and they keep track of their own progress. So they are seeing a visible sign that they're improving, which these time practices, then short time practices, will be encouraging because they'll see themselves improving. That's what I'm hearing.
Great. I'm going to want you to attach a graph or something, a visual for our listeners.
Like a bar graph. A bar
Yeah.
graph. So in
That's
other
cool.
words,
No, I'm just saying, let's see if we
or
could find, let's just see if we could find a cool one so people will have a graphic in the show notes. Maybe we could find one.
yeah, I mean, it's basically just a way for kids to see that their ORF, their oral reading fluency, is going up.
That's fascinating because I'll tell you, in the States, what I'm seeing is a lot of kids, even in early childhood, are struggling. Their kids are making gains in being able to decode CVC words, different syllable types, but then you give them a reading passage and that transfer piece, even for kids in the early grades, it's not as easy. It's like, oh my God, I have to read a passage and I only have a minute and I have to sound good and be able to, read in phrases. And for many kids that are still cracking the code and aren't strong at decoding, their oral reading fluency scores are coming low and not meeting benchmarks. And how can we motivate or help these kids? I mean, I have some ideas, but what are some ideas you might have? So Faith, was what you guys were suggesting is timing kids to read, but what would that look like in terms of like,
I'm just going to jump in and say something.
Yeah.
You're not going to see much progress if their decoding skills have not been developed to a point where the ORF is going to pick it up. So if they are in the beginning stage of learning how to decode and they're given a second grade passage, let's say, but they're really beginners, you're not going to see much until they've been taught enough to really see that.
So what do we do for those? So what do we do to monitor that for early readers and kids, that might be at the high school level or middle school level, so that we could monitor it and could track it and could start seeing those gains?
So in our program, we have two two areas where we time students. One we do every lesson when they are using sequence sets of words that we've been teaching them to decode. And the idea is that they will reach mastery criteria depending on their age group. So for our year 9 students, for example, who are grade 8, they need to be able to read 110 words a minute from a list. It's a randomized list within a certain range. And if we want to guarantee automaticity, we really want to be getting those kids to 110 words a minute if they're 13 years old. And by the time they're 14, we want them to be at about 120 words a minute. And by the time they're 15, we want them to be at about 130 words a minute. Now, the other area that I should say, they keep doing that sequence of words until they reach that criterion. And then they move to the next level of difficulty.
With 100% accuracy.
Yeah, they have to have 100% accuracy and 110 or 120 words per minute, depending on the year group. And then for the part of our lesson where students read connected prose from a text, they will have practiced every section of that text before they read the whole thing to the teacher as a kind of final test for that level. And part of that, the teacher will time their reading for a minute. And the aim of that is to just check what's your oral reading fluency like with connected text. And again, we know that because the precision teachers have done all this research with case studies, students can read at 180 words a minute comfortably when they're really fluent. Our concern is mostly, can they read it better than 100 words a minute? That's the level at which we're going to intervene and do something. So we ask our teachers, measure that. If they get less than 100 words a minute, the student needs some help to build up their fluency.
And if I can just add that when they're reading that all of that text, we just told the child that at some stage during that reading, we're going to time them for a minute and just to ignore the timer.
Yep.
So the teacher, the tutor will just put an asterisk at the point where they're going to put the timer on. They'll put the timer on, times for a minute, and then they'll put an asterisk at the end, but the child just continues reading. So I think it takes the pressure off a little bit.
Yeah, for the child, they're just focusing on reading the text well. The teacher just has to remember to time a minute of that reading. But those things are really helpful. Now, in terms of the general classroom, it's a little bit trickier, but there is no reason, for example, that a teacher couldn't set aside 3 minutes of the day once you've taught the students the routine. Okay, you're going to go into your pairs, you're going to do your 1 minute timed reading. They know what they're going to do. They've each got a timer per pair. They go and get it from the basket, sit down in their pair, take turns reading, write down the score, put everything away, and they're sitting back ready to go in about 4 minutes' time.
So what I'm hearing is you are in agreement with Tim Shanahan when he talks about this threshold. Like students who are below a certain threshold need this type of work. And, he says it right here. For those students, they need a dedicated explicit phonics intervention in addition to anything else you can provide to support their literacy learning. Phonics is unlikely to be enough for those kids, but without it, they won't advance. So on my part, I'm going to leave off with that. And if there's anything else, Judy, if you have any questions you'd like to add, or we're okay?
I think, Faith, what you just said was perfect. And I think that was Tim's main point, is we can't ignore the other pillars of literacy instruction. It's not just about phonics. And that's the message the Literacy View has been trying to get out to the world for a very long time, because some people think, oh, there's just this hyper focus on phonics. It's way more than just phonics. So let me see, any remaining questions? I think one of the main things that I learned from the article is that very often this has to be done in a tier 2 and tier 3 setting. Now, do you have any recommendations for a classroom teacher? Is there could this be done in small group in the classroom as well, or is that not going to be as efficient?
It's not going to be as effective for the student. If the school isn't going to spend any money on setting up interventions, or they don't have any teachers with the expertise, there is no point in taking children out of the classroom. But if you're a teacher, and I've met a few, and they say, we just don't have anything for students in our school in terms of additional help for those who are left behind, then it's incumbent on us as teachers to do something. Now, and what I would say is those short bursts of practice in those component skills are really important. The other thing is, if you can, using those strategies I mentioned earlier, particularly paired reading and small group reading, where they're getting help from a slightly more able reader, and they are taking 5 minutes out of a lesson maybe to read a passage, and the students are trained to correct and support each other. They can get an awful lot of reading practice. I often say to schools, if every student reads 800 words a lesson, which is about 5 to 7 minutes of reading, in 5 lessons a day, 25 lessons a week, at the end of the year, they will have read 800,000 words of challenging subject-related content. And you're not relying on parents, you're not relying on after-school clubs, you're not relying on the SEN department. You are teaching that child in your classroom, and every other teacher's teaching that child in their classroom. And so that's going to give them nearly all the practice they need to get to a reasonable level of fluency. But realistically, children who are 3 or more years behind are not going to make enough progress to catch up unless they have sophisticated intervention.
That's a really good response, because I think a lot of schools are short of manpower or short of, time, and I guess this conversation needs to be had. But I know that the sad truth is not every school is going to have the kids pulled out. So if they can't, any words of wisdom?
I'll let you talk in a minute, but I just want to finish my thought. I think the key thing is, unless what they are being pulled out to is capable of delivering a reasonable amount of progress, and by we would say a minimum amount of progress is 3 months progress for every month in the intervention. That is the slowest you can go. Otherwise, they are actually better off being in the classroom, keeping up with the curriculum, getting the practice, learning with their peers. So it's not just about can we tick a box? Yes, they're being given a reading intervention. The question is it effective enough to make it worth taking them out of the classroom?
I really appreciate that. I really appreciate
And
it.
I have to tell you,
yeah.
I just want to say, I'm going to press the BS button on schools where they pull kids out and just waste a lot of time. So that's getting a BS button right there.
And here, last one. Any additional tips for our ENL and special ed students? I guess a lot of these kids might have IEPs and BNL, but any secret tips? And this is my last one for ENL and SPEDS.
What's ENL?
English as a new language. English as a new language.
Okay. So definitely with children who have English as an additional language, it's really important that their oral language is at a decent enough level before they can learn to read in English. There's something over here called the Hillary Hester scale, and I used to take children who were level 3 or level 4, and the special needs coordinator was my friend, and she twisted my arm to take 2 boys who were level 2, and I'm pleased that I did, because it just emphasized the fact they didn't have enough oral language. I spent so much time just explaining the vocabulary to them. So it's really important that their vocabulary is at a good level, their oral vocabulary. But the other thing I'd say with children with special needs, sometimes it's actually not special needs, it's just a reading gap. And I would say that, having a reading gap is not necessarily, it's just, it's an instructional deficit that needs rectifying. And I think, sometimes we're very quick to apply labels to children when they just need to be taught properly.
I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. Do both of you have any last thoughts? We talked about a lot, but if there's anything we left out, here's your chance.
Okay, I would just say to schools who are not intervening well for children who are reading well behind, that reading is fundamental. It is the most important thing that schools can teach. It is fundamental to so much in life. And schools have a moral majority. Sorry, not a moral majority. They have a moral responsibility to ensure that every child leaves school reading well.
And it can be done.
Yes.
It can be done. You heard it here on the Literacy View. That's a wrap. So that was an amazing conversation about adolescent literacy. I know that it reinforced many of the things that I felt strongly about. I think that it was great having Tim Shanahan's article as a way to start the conversation, but having both of you on with your level of expertise and passion for the topic was just incredible. Judy, can you just wrap up the show with last thoughts? Go ahead.
All right. So thank you, James and Dianne. This was a pleasure recording with you. And follow us on the literacyview.com. That's our website. You can now advertise with the Literacy View. All the rules on how to advertise with us and how to contact us are on the website. Also, if you love what we're doing, we are now finally accepting donations because it costs money to make a podcast. So thanks for supporting us. Please, please, please spread the word about the Literacy View. And last but not least, please join us on our Facebook group, The Literacy View, Real Teachers Letting Loose. Thank you so much. And we're changing lives, hopefully one view at a time.
Thank you.
Thank you.